So, in my first lecture, I examined the way in which the career of Frank Lloyd Wright, a quintessential starchitect, had been dependent upon collaboration with a wide variety of women, including one of the most original and talented renderers of the day, as well as two path-breaking patrons. Today, collaboration will continue to be a theme, but my focus is the relationship of one relatively celebrated woman pioneer, as well as one much less well-known female architect, and an industry whose association with women has at times hindered and at times advanced their success as architects, that is, fashion. As I briefly discussed last time, women of increasingly modest and social and economic positions have, across the course of the last several centuries, assumed increased responsibility for the decor of their domestic surroundings. As a scholar, I hope to soon embark on a study that will reassess their impact as middle-class consumers upon the dissemination of modernism internationally in the 1930s through the 1950s. Such a study might focus on the publications of architecture and design in leading women's magazines and the women's pages of major newspapers, on the female editors and journalists responsible for much of that writing, and on the many cutting-edge design shops and businesses run by women such as Astrid Eriksson in Stockholm, Marie Gulliksen in Finland, and Florence Knoll in the United States, and real estate developer Corina Kavanaugh in Buenos Aires. That work is not yet advanced enough to present to you today. It needs some funding to travel to all those places. Today, instead, I want to focus upon the way that German designer Lilly Reich and the Scottish architect Margaret Brodie fused contemporary assumptions about women's association with fashion and their own commitment to modern architecture in exhibitions held between 1927 and 1938 in Berlin, Barcelona, and Glasgow. I suggest that there are three reasons that you do not know that much, or that you do not know more, you may know quite a bit already, about these women and their work. The first, of course, is that they were women. But the other two are equally important. For roughly a century, advocates and opponents of modern architecture have defended or decried it based in part on the assumption that it was politically progressive at the least, if not actually socialist or even communist. From the beginning, as its engagement with fashion repeatedly shows, modern architecture was also often commercial and indeed luxurious. Moreover, although Reich and Brodie certainly found their careers personally emancipatory, their politics were not consistently progressive. Reich designed exhibitions for the Third Reich, that is for the Nazi state, that were very similar to those that she created for industry during the period of German democracy that preceded the Nazi dictatorship. While Brodie was the project architect for the final British exhibition celebrating the empire, to which India already refused to contribute. I begin with Reich, who was trained as an interior and exhibition designer. She was not an architect. By 1925, however, she was in contact with an ambitious contemporary who was. Within 2 years, she was the personal as well as professional partner of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Their association lasted over a decade. While he was director of the Bauhaus, Mies appointed her to run the weaving workshop, where she was unpopular because she was not a weaver herself. Neither did it help that she represented an urbane connection to department stores and industry that the more countercultural weavers largely eschewed. Reich trained in Vienna with Joseph Hoffmann and in Berlin with Elsa Oppler-Legband. In her 20s and 30s, her career often took gender-appropriate paths as she focused on interiors for youth and women and on the fashion industry and the fabric that was its chief raw material. Reich's earliest known interiors date to 1911, when she was responsible for the furnishing of a youth center in Berlin. You see it there at the top. She had already worked on as an exhibition designer for the elegant Wertheim department store. The next year, she contributed to the exhibition The Woman at Home and at Work, and work really meaning the word beruf, meaning career, and designed a shop window for the Elephant Pharmacy in Berlin, which was published in the yearbook of the German Werkbund, to whose board of directors she was elected in 1920. She was the first woman to serve in that position. That same year, she was the artistic director of an exhibition on craft and fashion, organized by the Association of the German Fashion Industry. 2 years later, in 1922, she contributed an article on contemporary fashion to the Werkbund's journal Die Form. During the 1920s, Wright designed a succession of important trade fairs, culminating in From the Fiber to the Trade exhibition held in Frankfurt's Festhalle in 1926, which you see at the bottom here. Here she pioneered the emphasis on the display of the raw material that would be the hallmark of the work she did in collaboration with Mies. Late 19th century German self-consciousness about space's experiential and aesthetic qualities arose in a context in which carefully crafted spaces were increasingly being deployed for uses very different from the evocation of the spiritual and the expression of political power that had been the key tasks with which Renaissance and Baroque architects had been charged. The vast new spaces of the exhibition hall and the department store, and there's the exhibition hall in Frankfurt again, and the Wertheim department store in Berlin, made possible by innovations in the production of glass, iron, and steel, allowed for the display of a dizzying array of products. One early 20th century German reaction against the visual cacophony this engendered was the focus, as you see here, upon a small number of goods, set at a clear distance from one another, often within a shop window, and carefully illuminated, typically with electric lighting. Then a new technology. Such installations of commodities, such as the elegant shoes, highlighted in a series of shop windows designed by Salamander for Salamander by August Endel in Berlin around 1910, focused attention on carefully selected and usually understatedly designed objects. That similar strategies for the display of objects were pioneered nearly simultaneously in museums, where they were no longer for sale, was no accident. Isolating either one, the shoe or the painting, drew increased attention to its quality of surfaces at a time when art was moving from representation towards abstraction. Similarly, the artisanship of the shoes in the Salamander window mattered more than ornamentation. Although more mundane commodities would soon receive equally compelling attention, such display strategies were not initially employed for goods that were unnecessarily ornate. The economy of these displays also paralleled developments in set design. From here, it was a short step to the abstraction advocated by artists like Vasily Kandinsky for both painting and theater, and not a much longer one to Reich and Mies's even more experimental designs. Here you see the stage that Adolf Appia inserted into Heinrich Tessenows' Festspielhaus in the Dresden garden suburb of Hellerau. What is not so clear in the photograph is the way the lighting worked, with electricity and translucent cloth harnessed to create startling new effects. Some of you may have heard Lutz Rober speak in my Modern Architecture module last semester about the ways in which this anticipates aspects of Mies and Reich's exhibition architecture. And Mies had frequently visited his fiancée, later wife, at Hellerau when she studied dance there. The new strategies of display developed in the last years before the outbreak of World War I were further revived in the late 1920s, above all by Reich working in collaboration with Mies. For an exhibition called The Dwelling, held in Stuttgart in 1927, she designed a model apartment, which I show you at the top, and collaborated with Mies on installations for the plate glass, which you see here, and linoleum industries. Also dating to 1927 is their Silk and Velvet Cafe for the Fashion for Women exhibition held in Berlin that year. The product exhibitions designed between 1927 and 1931 by Reich, often working with Mies, were emphatically commercial in character. Comparing these installations with her model domestic interiors elucidates their originality as well as their origins in a German discourse about space that developed independently of skeletal steel and concrete frames or of abstract painting and sculpture. New spatial practices, such as those that Reich and Mies developed in their exhibition displays, dovetailed as well with new ways of looking, whose theatricality was grounded in salesmanship, even as it was also harnessed to new ways of displaying art. Displays trumpeting particular industries such as glass, linoleum, silk, and wood were arranged in a way that alienated the visitor from the usual settings in which these materials were found and enhanced an awareness of their tactile properties. Furniture, on the other hand, was integrated into model interiors that, despite their relative austerity, domesticated their austere form. That both sorts of types of environments are known through only a small number of published photographs highlights their temporary character, as well as the care with which they were staged. The Silk and Velvet Cafe was created for the Association of German Silk Manufacturers in the context of a trade fair focused on women's fashion, held, as I said, in 1927 in Berlin. At the time, Mies was designing houses in the city of Krefeld, a center of German silk production, for two members of the association. Wright contributed to the design of the furnishings for those dwellings. The Silk and Velvet Cafe was housed in Berlin's convention hall at the radio tower. Reich chose the strong colors of the velvet and silk, black, red, and orange in the first case, and gold, silver, black, and a bold lemon yellow in the second, that she and Mies hung over the tubular steel framing. Few of those who perched on the resilient chairs to take coffee and perhaps a piece of cake at the even more precarious glass-topped tables probably closely inspected the gathered panels of various heights, textures, and colors that transformed the hall into two curved enclosures and masked much of the rest of the immediate surroundings. Nor were they encouraged to linger upon the cafe's commercial purpose. The letters, suspended one story higher, spelling out the words Samt and Seide, silk and velvet, or velvet and silk, struck the only obvious advertising note. Yet the sumptuousness of the textiles was critical in establishing this clearly temporary installation as chic rather than cheap, and the curves into which patrons could nestle created a comforting sense of almost secretive seclusion that must also have enhanced the scheme's allure. As Robert Schuldenfrei helps demonstrate in her forthcoming book, much of modernism's original experimentation, including even product design at the Bauhaus, occurred in the context of creating fashionable luxury. Moreover, this was luxury which I would hasten to add specifically supported social rituals and particular types of consumer expertise associated with well-to-do women, such as those who would cluster here to view the latest fashions, and in some cases work as buyers to purchase them for elegant shops and department stores, or write about them for the fashion press. There was no comparable experimentation with space or surface in the context, for instance, of social housing, which was necessarily far more pragmatic in character. The same year that they designed the temporary Berlin Cafe, Mies directed the construction of the Weissenhof housing estate in Stuttgart. This was a housing exhibition organized by the Werkbund that provided up-to-the-minute dwellings for the city's civil servants. Rather than housing the working class, many of these dwellings, designed by a who's who of two generations of European modernists, included maids' rooms. Mies contributed an apartment building for which I've already shown you. Reich decorated one of the units. The exhibition, whose overall installation was organized by Wright, were displayed in a separate, already existing structure. Reich's name was listed ahead of Mies's in the credits for the plate glass exhibition that I show you here, and also for the linoleum exhibition. The combination of comfortable upholstery, spare wooden cabinetry, and elegantly chromed steel Reich employed in her model apartment also characterized the plate glass exhibition. No curtains, however, unless you count the fabric ceiling, which, as at Hallowell, helped diffuse the light, softened the spare lines of this space, which was instead defined by large panes of opaque and transparent glass. Although almost as enclosed as conventional domestic rooms, there was a looseness in the plan that related as much to the need to be traversed by a large number of visitors as to the relative transparency, or at the least translucency, of its boundaries. Surprisingly nearly absent was the contrapuntal composition rooted in the plans of Schinkel's villas in the outskirts of Potsdam, as Barry Bergdahl has discussed, as well as more recent De Stijl and constructivist art that were so critical to Mies's concrete and brick country house projects of just a few years earlier. Instead, the emphasis here was on surfaces that framed the space while suggesting something beyond it. The edges mattered rather more than the objects between or beyond them, which served mostly to anchor what might otherwise seem too ethereal and ephemeral to notice. An attentiveness to color also featured here, although of course my slides don't show it. Olive green and mouse gray glass coexisted with white and possibly also red linoleum flooring. Their nuanced use of color distinguished Reich and Mies's work from the preference many of their modernist contemporaries had for white, supplemented only intermittently by stark primaries. The Silk and Velvet Cafe and the plate glass installations have been widely recognized as marking an important turning point in Mies's work. This was a kind of work that Reich had done before meeting Mies and continued to do independently of him, but to which Mies devoted almost no attention once he left her and Germany behind in 1937. Her contribution to this aspect of his development has thus long been considered crucial. I was taught this already in the 80s. It didn't take the latest push of feminism. Crucially, the fabric screens in the Velvet and Silk Cafe anticipated the use Mies would make of flat glass and onyx and curved wooden walls in his two most important commissions of the German phase of his career, the German Pavilion in Barcelona of 1929, better known as the Barcelona Pavilion, and the two Goethe House, which you see here at the bottom. In Barcelona in 1929, Reich and Mies collaborated on a group of 25 displays at the International Exhibition. The one devoted to German textiles is particularly germane to this discussion. The presumption has always been that Reich was largely responsible for it, as Mies was busy with the more prestigious pavilion, as well as another building for the German electric industry, the subject of a recent article in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. In the silk display, which I show you here, it was almost as if the plan of the German pavilion had been exploded to accommodate the crowds within the large exhibit hall. One arrangement clearly echoed but dematerialized the cruciform profile of the pavilion's columns. Working in a much higher space and in what was just one portion of a larger exhibition hall, Reich masterfully varied the height, width, and depth of planes composed of both fabric itself and of colored glass, against which she set fabric draped over the same chrome steel she and Mies had used so often in their furniture. The arrangement was, if anything, more elegant than that of the earlier cafe, as well as more effective in showcasing a wider array of fabrics. 2 years later, Reich and Mies addressed the issue of how to exhibit modern domestic spaces and the material out of which they were composed, once again in their contributions to the exhibition The Dwelling of Our Time, organized by Mies in the Berlin Fairgrounds in 1931. You see his house in the background and hers in the foreground here. Reich also exhibited 2 apartments, one for a married couple and one for a single person, and contributed 25 product displays in her own name that ringed the upper level of the exhibition hall, plus a display for the Wertheim department store. Despite the sophisticated manipulation of space and the many installations Reich and Mies had designed together for various industries, or that she designed on her own here, when she was charged with positioning their furniture in domestic settings, Reich returned to the creation of relatively conventional spaces. The only strong trace of the product displays in her model interiors could be found in the deep cabinetry of various heights that could serve as a headboard for a bed, as a cabinet, or even to contain a kitchenette. While curtains help divide some spaces, they acted mostly to sharpen the definition of edges. Instead, the emphasis was on furniture that, although meticulously positioned, often appears light enough to be moved about easily within modestly scaled interiors. A sense of expansive luxury was provided above all by the quality of the materials and the sparseness of the interventions Reich made, not by the size of the spaces. In comparison to the interiors of Mies's admittedly much larger adjacent dwelling, her model house is an inspired response to relatively cramped conditions. Mies was forced to close the Bauhaus in 1933, but many of those associated with the school continued to find work during the Third Reich. Of these, the glass installation in the government-sponsored German Work exhibition of 1934 in Berlin was certainly the most original, not least in the way in which it highlighted the apparent insubstantial quality of the material. Such experimentation became more difficult in the later 30s, although Reich also designed, as I show you at the bottom, the fabric display in Albert Speer's German pavilion for the World's Fair held in Paris in 1938. Mies first traveled to the United States in 1937. The following year, he accepted an appointment at the Armour Institute, later the Illinois Institute of Technology, in Chicago. Wright came to visit in the summer of 1939, but because of the dissolution of their personal partnership, returned to Berlin, where she died in 1947. She was not a party member, and there is no reason to believe that she sympathized with the regime, even when she took the boat back to Germany after the outbreak of the war. Nonetheless, she was rightfully tainted by the association. Independently and in collaboration with Mies, Reich developed strategies for focusing the viewer's attention on only apparently banal objects, whether a length of fabric or a sheet of glass, that included highlighting their isolation in space. She did this to sell products, but in a way that was straightforwardly informative rather than consciously seductive. New kinds of furnishings, in contrast, needed to be domesticated in ways that entailed less radical manipulations of space. Although the display spaces Wright created are no longer novel, the attentiveness to looking and to focusing on qualities that are not superficial but engage the materiality of the objects themselves remains integral to much subsequent artistic practice. In particular, I've explored elsewhere how she foreshadows minimalism. Neither the intentness of looking nor its abstraction insulate this art, however, from the culture of salesmanship that was integral to Reich and Mies's work as exhibition designers. Presuming that these installations can be discussed in merely formal terms, as is almost always the case, paradoxically supports this great myth surrounding modern architecture, which, again, that it was inherently politically progressive, if not an outright manifestation of socialist or communist views. In fact, it often served the marketplace under both democratic and authoritarian conditions. Many early 20th century Germans found in abstraction a compellingly pragmatic new way of selling products, one that was shorn from much, but not all, of the association with social status that adhered to many earlier forms of display, in particular palatial department stores and exhibition halls. These shifts were associated with the emergence of a mass public, but they were not inherently social or politically emancipatory, which is why they could continue so easily into the Third Reich. Reich's role as an innovator has been downplayed not simply because she was a woman, but also because her flair for fashion rendered suspect her contribution to some of the 20th century's most compelling and enduring strategies for drawing attention to both space and surface. That she continued to do so while supporting herself by working as a designer who received government commissions from the Third Reich further compromised her in ways that contributed to her being written out of Cold War histories of modern architecture, which emphasized that modern architecture was antithetical to authoritarian politics, which it was not. Dress and architecture were closely intertwined in my second example. Although overlooked today, the Glasgow Empire Exhibition of 1938 was the largest showcase for modern architecture erected on these islands in the interwar period. Here again, the politics in support, in this case, of empire, by which was largely meant the settler dominions rather than the territories administered directly from Whitehall, account for some of the marginalization, as does the fact that none of the architects responsible belonged to the avant-garde, although Sir Basil Spence, whose firm later built our own James Joyce Library, and who designed the paired Scottish pavilions for the exhibition, went on to have a very distinguished career. The architect in charge was Thomas Tate, today almost forgotten, but at the time the leading Scottish-born and trained architect active in London. The project architect, Margaret Brodie, also designed the building you see here and here, the Women of Empire Pavilion, which is one of the buildings that received the most visitors and the most press attention. Although the two real landmarks were the tower and the prow-shaped restaurant, both of which are visible here, the tower here, the prow-shaped restaurant over there. Brodie was born in 1907, the daughter of a civil engineer. She was one of three sisters, all of whom went to university. She was fortunate that her professor at the Glasgow School of Architecture, T. Harold Hughes, and his wife Edith proved extremely supportive of the school's early female students. After becoming the first woman in Scotland to qualify as an architect, Through Mrs. Hughes's connection, she found a position in London with Burnett Tate and Lord, the firm charged with designing and supervising the construction of the exhibition. And here she is with the team responsible for the exhibition design. Very fashionably attired, of course. The Empire Exhibition, all but one of whose structures was quickly disassembled afterwards, was by far the largest ensemble of buildings in a largely abstract style erected in Britain in the first half of the 20th century. The architecture was somewhat derivative, especially of the French architect Robert Mallet-Stevens and his Dutch counterpart W.M. Dudok, and also of Scandinavians like Gunnar Asplund, much more than it was influenced by, say, Alvar Aalto from Finland or Eric Mendelsohn, who had recently completed the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill, a competition he won thanks to Tate. Although forward-looking, nothing on view in Glasgow was as radical as what Reich and Mies had put on display 11 years earlier in Stuttgart or Berlin, or for that matter, 9 years earlier in Barcelona. The Women of the Empire Pavilion was typical of the architecture of the exhibit, low-lying without the bold towers that marked its most important buildings. Brodie's 15,000 square foot pavilion, nonetheless, was a frank indication of the possibilities unleashed by the combination of skeletal steel construction and a frankly abstract aesthetic encouraged by the ample use throughout the exhibit of a product called gyprock. This was manufactured locally by the Distillers Company, who also made whiskey, of course, which opened a new factory to fill the orders triggered by the exhibition. The pavilion included a fashion theater, as well as an exhibition of historical dress, and a tea room, which, following a well-established local tradition, was run entirely by women. As Jean Kelvin reported in the local newspaper, the Glasgow Herald, the day before the opening of the exhibition, and I quote, "Scrolled across a large mural painting representing women in their many varied spheres is this admirable legend, 'Blessed is she who has found work.'" Today we tend to think of the interwar period as one in which women's work was centered in the home, but readers of the Herald knew better. Just the day before, the newspaper had reported the resignation of Catherine Stewart Murray, the Duchess of Atholl, as the Conservative Party's whip in the Houses of Parliament, due to her disagreement with Neville Chamberlain over his policy towards fascist Italy, which she regarded as entirely too cozy. So she was one of the most important Scottish politicians of the day. The Herald's coverage of the Women of the Empire Pavilion and the larger exhibition of which it was a part demonstrates how popular, if less original, this strain of modernism was than that on which we tend to focus. Frankly commercial and fashionable, it challenges our hope that modern architecture had this emancipatory detachment from consumer capitalism. The local Independent Labour Party did not support the exhibition or appreciate its architecture. Yet the global enthusiasm for this approach, with those who were comfortably middle class, undercuts the claim that the monumental neoclassicism that dominated the International Exhibition in Paris the year before was, for better or worse, the style of the moment, and that it was a lack of popularity that in the 1930s temporarily stunted the careers of figures such as Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. What interested the Herald was instead what Walter Elliott, the Secretary of State for Scotland, described as the modern spirit of light, speed, and color. Modern architecture made a clear break with what was seen as a troubled past, an editorial remark. The spaciousness and dignity of the Bella Houston buildings do make a sharp and painful contrast with some of the mean and dirty streets by which one travels from the city to the brave new world. This transformation was not intended, however, to challenge the authority of established institutions such as the monarchy. And here you see Queen Elizabeth, Scottish-born, and her husband, the King. They've been reigned for only about a year at this point, visiting for the inaugural ceremonies. After all, the recently widowed Queen Mary, the King's mother, visited the Women of Empire Pavilion 3 times in a single week. Instead, which is one of the reasons it was so popular afterwards, instead what was cherished was a combination of freshness and pleasure exuded by, and I quote, buildings that catch the breath by their bold design and distinctive coloring, their broad facades and severe lines offset by cheerful tones and decorative murals. Moreover, it was abundantly clear that women of all classes were the target audience for the exhibit in general, as well as the particular pavilion given to Brodie to design. Addressing a gathering near the close of the exhibition, Isabel Hamilton Gordon, Lady Aberdeen, declared, and the, I guess, daughter-in-law probably of the Lady Aberdeen who had been so active in Ireland, declared in a very real sense the exhibition had been a women's exhibition. No tally had been kept of how many men and how many men and how many women had entered the exhibition, but she made bold to say that women had been greatly in the majority. Although due in part to the Sunday closings mandated by local Presbyterianism, as well as one of the wettest summers on record, attendance did not reach the hoped-for figure of 15 million. Brodie's pavilion was one of the most popular attractions. It was a favorite of dignitaries. Queen Elizabeth came on the opening day. The Countess of Elgin, who presided over the pavilion across the run of the exhibition, presented Brodie to her. At the Queen's request, however, the audience in the Fashion Theatre awaiting her consisted largely of the men who had built the exhibition and their wives, so working class. And journalists went out of their way to stress that working class women identified the designs on view as ones they were well able to make and would like to wear. Organizers were also clear about the purpose of the exhibition. Edward Simmons declared, "I'm not trying to sell styles or fashions via the displays in the Fashion Theatre, but to make the people of the British Empire in particular, and those of the world in general, conscious of the beauty and the fashion rightness of British fabrics for all seasons and occasions." The Herald's coverage also made clear that the target audience for the pavilion was not simply women of all classes from Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. When Kelvin lamented in a column written at the end of August that the latest autumn fashions were not on display, Simmons responded that we have visitors not only from the cold and damp north, but from all parts of the world in general, conscious of the beauty and the fashion rightness of British fabrics for all seasons and all occasions, and defended the decision to focus on lighter, summery clothing. And here I show you the Southern Rhodesian Pavilion, now Zimbabwe, and the Australia Pavilion. The Empire Exhibition, it should be noticed, focused above all on Britain's relationship with Ireland and the settler-ruled dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and what's now Zimbabwe, rather than with its other colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, among which only Burma had its own pavilion, and as I said, the Indians refused to get involved. Very few traces of the references to pre-modern Asian and African architecture that infused Lutyens' New Delhi, begun in 1912, the Wembley Empire Exhibition in London of 1925 and 26, or the Colonial Exhibition held in Paris in 1931, could be found in Glasgow. The Empire Exhibition was modern not in the matter of the European masters who still dominate the stories we tell about the architecture of the interwar years. Instead, it was modern in the matter of those in Tel Aviv and Bombay or Johannesburg and Baghdad who wanted to be new and different from the Europe they had left behind or the one whose rule they hoped to soon slough off completely. Few, if any, of these people turned in the 1930s to Britain for inspiration when they wanted buildings that looked obviously new. The Empire Exhibition was intended to engage their attention and even their respect. And although much of this initial globalization of what was beginning to be termed the international style was commercial, when it was domestic, it was often a demonstration of exactly the kind of progressively minded upper middle class taste that coincided with encouraging women to pursue professional careers, not least as architects. And as I'll show you in a later lecture, Zaha Hadid and Denise Scott Brown grew up in houses created in the 1930s in this milieu in Baghdad and Johannesburg. As became a genteel woman of her generation, Brodie mostly kept out of the newspaper until near the end of her life. The exceptional mention occurred when a woman journalist on holiday in Jersey happened to overhear a conversation in a hotel lobby. "Yes," continued the elderly gentleman with the cultured voice, "it was an open competition, of course. The designs were displayed anonymously, and when the winner was announced to be a dame from Glasgow, you could have heard a pin drop. Brodie was the name. Nice young woman." The result was a war memorial and art block for Victoria College, a prestigious secondary school for boys. It was completed in 1952. In later years, Brodie built a modest career as an architect specializing in the design of modern churches and was a teacher at the Glasgow School of Architecture, where, according to her obituary, she was forceful, demanding, but kindly, with, and I quote, "a pocky sense of humor and a highly refined sense of irony." Shortly before her death, at the age of 90, Brodie was made a fellow of the Glasgow School of Art. This was reported to be something which she dismissed to friends as so much nonsense. However, it gave her immense pleasure and satisfaction in the acknowledgement that she was not merely one of the school's most distinguished female alumni, but one of Scotland's leading creative forces of her generation. And here I show you the not so distinguished St. Martin's in Port Glasgow of 1957 and St. Brendan's in Rothesay of 1975. St. Brendan's has already been torn down. Both commissions stem from her long-standing engagement with the Church of Scotland. In 1974, she became the first woman convener of a full committee of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Modern architecture was in the interwar period both more popular and more fashionable than is widely admitted, as well as more commercial and more luxurious. Precisely this situation provided space for women like Reich and Brodie, as well as others both more and less celebrated, to make major and minor contributions to its development. What was presumed, according to the gendered conventions of the time, to be their knowledge of the home, of fabrics, and of fashion, helped them gain commissions for the display of interiors, cloth, and clothing alike. Their achievements were in turn particularly likely to be celebrated by female journalists. Playing into preconceptions about the appropriateness of women permitted them to simultaneously extend their careers in new directions, ones they shared with a generation of spirited designers, architects, reporters, journalists, and businesswomen. Acknowledging this contribution does not mean to undermine the efforts of contemporary feminists to create more just and equitable societies. Thank you.